Good evening and welcome. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for our event. This is a event sponsored this evening by the local Montclair Democratic County Committee. I want to recognize local Montclair resident Carrie Shavat for helping us pull it together. And we are joined by two Montclair residents who are familiar to all of us for all of their work. First, joining us this evening is Mary Alice Williams. She's going to be our host for this evening. She is an award-winning, pioneering television journalist. Her accolades are many, and we want to thank her for taking the time to be with us tonight to host a very special conversation with none other than Jonathan Alter. Jonathan has joined us before, has supported our organization, and we thank him for that, but also is always willing to lend a hand and a voice to not only his national work, but also to his local community, and we're thankful for that. And Jonathan, in addition to being the premier political commentator and an accomplished author, is here tonight to talk a little bit about the national election, but also about his new book, The Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. So I'm looking very forward to this conversation. Want to be sensitive to both of their schedules because I know how packed it is. And again, want to thank them on behalf of the Montclair Democratic County Committee for taking the time to be here. And with that, I will turn it over to Mary Alice Williams. Mary.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here with John, who's an old friend. We covered way too many campaigns together. And you're going to be able to ask him questions about his fifth and latest book through the chat at the bottom of your Zoom page. And later on, of course, you'll have a rescheduled signing ceremony. Now, all of us I know are dying to hear your take, John, on the fight to replace the blessed RBG, its effect on the presidential campaign, and how this historic election will play out at the ballot box and in the US mailbox, too. And I promise you all, we're going to get to that. But let's start with John's beautifully written, exhaustively researched book. You know, there's an enduring historical judgment about Jimmy Carter that likens him to the Wizard of Oz, who, when Dorothy discovers the man behind the curtain, says, "You're a very bad man." And he replies, "No, I'm a very good man. I'm just a very bad wizard." Jonathan Alter has blown a hole through that illusion, giving us with eloquence and prodigious research, a portrait of a quite consequential president who never got the credit he deserved. John's book, His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, is the first full-length biography of the 39th President of the United States and Nobel Prize-winning humanitarian. It presents a man who's been considered a relic of the past as instead a role model for the present. Congratulations on this book, John. This is an epic achievement.
Thanks, Mary Alice, and thanks to Carrie and Brendan, and you know, I haven't monetarily supported Democrats in this area. That wouldn't be right, but I've really enjoyed taking part in a lot of different forums over the years, and I'm really happy to be with people tonight. I wish it was in person. I will. Anybody who buys a book can guaranteed get it signed and inscribed by me, and we'll have a session where we talk more about the book later. Unfortunately, this is kind of a good problem for me to have, but I made a film with a couple of other people from Montclair, John Block and Steve McCarthy, and it's called Breslin and Hamill, Deadline Artists, and it's up for an Emmy tonight, a documentary Emmy. So at about 25 after 8, I'm going to have to skedaddle upstairs to be in position in case lightning strikes and we get the Emmy. But what I wanted to say was that, just to pick up on what Mary Alice said, so the conventional view of Jimmy Carter is, inept president, great former president. And to me, that is a woefully incomplete description of him. And I actually think he was a better than people realize, an underrated American president and a tad overrated as a former president. Let me just go with the latter first. So when you leave office, you don't have any of the levers of power to get things done for people. So he has been the most impactful former president in American history, with the possible exception of John Quincy Adams, who went to the House of Representatives after he left office and was active against slavery. Carter has essentially close to eradicated a disease called guinea worm disease. He's monitored elections all over the world, especially in 1994. He did some very important peacekeeping in Haiti and North Korea, and a number of other things. And of course, everybody knows he built houses. That's not something that he doesn't run Habitat for Humanity, but 1 week a year, he and Rosalind, his wife, build a house. And those are amazing accomplishments, but they're not nearly as significant as what he accomplished as president.
And I want to get through all of those well, actually, there's so many that I want to really focus on 3. But first of all, let me ask you this. Why did you immerse yourself in a past president at this time during these last 4 years?
So what happened was I'm in a book group, and somebody in the group knew Jimmy Carter's grandson. And we were reading a book about Carter and Camp David. And Carter himself came to our this is more than 5 years ago, to our book group. And, afterwards, I had been an intern for Jimmy Carter in 1978 in his speechwriting office. And I'd interviewed him for Newsweek, 20 years ago once. Now, that was really my only contact with him. But I was just so impressed with what he achieved at Camp David. And then when he talked about his human rights policy and how much change that brought, it really began the democratic revolution, which has, despite the authoritarianism we're now seeing in some countries, most of the world is democratic. That was not the case in the 20th century. And a lot of that is due to Jimmy Carter. So I just got fascinated, and I thought the shorthand, inept president, it just wasn't good enough. I knew that he was a political failure. But what I started to learn when I looked into him was that he was a substantive and very far-sighted success as president. And then I also got fascinated by his early life in the Jim Crow South. And then it helped me just in terms of access that my late editor, Alice Mayhew, who died this year, was also Jimmy Carter's editor at Simon & Schuster. So she just got me in the door, and I spent a lot of time with the Carters and everybody in their family.
Okay, so let's start in the rural South. To what extent was this child of rural Georgia really reminiscent of the 19th century, framed by a stern and unloving father?
Yeah, so Carter was, I like to think of him as being somebody from not even the 19th century. I mean, you could go back a long time before that. Carter likes to say it wasn't that different from when Jesus Christ walked the earth. He was barefoot most of the year. He lived, he was born in Plains in a hospital, actually. They had a small hospital there, the first president born in a hospital. But he lived on this farm on the outskirts of Plains, and they had no running water, no electricity. There was, they weren't poor, but it really was just one step up from slavery. It was a feudal Jim Crow system. His father, Mr. Earl, was a white supremacist, like most people in the area, most whites in the area, and very stern. And Jimmy had a lot of trouble with him, and they had a very fraught relationship, which I explore and help power Carter. His mother, Miss Lillian, was a nurse and took care of Black patients for free. Very tolerant, open-minded person, not to the point of violating all Jim Crow, but she was like the only person in the area who would ever talk about Abraham Lincoln.
She was the compassionate one. If Jimmy Carter got compassionate, it might have
Yes.
been his mother. But was she not a bit of a racist herself, just by virtue of where
She was, and that's something that Jimmy Carter tried to sugarcoat. And one of the things that I had to peel back to get to the truth of his early life was a lot of the myth that Carter himself had created about himself. And he wasn't lying, but he was just always accentuating the positive in his own books. And so, yes, she was not as much of an integrationist as her son suggested, but she did introduce compassion to him. I think a lot of his interest in global health obviously came from her. But actually, after she died, Carter revealed that the person who really raised him and taught him about religion and nature, which are two of the most important parts of his life, was an illiterate Black woman farmhand who lived on their property. And her name was Rachel Clark. And so I conjure this world of the 20s and 30s and what it was like to be that boy and what that did for him and how that powered his really epic American journey. And so I came to think of his story as being just one of the most compelling biographies of any American president when you look at the distance that he traveled to the White House.
Now, one of your tidbits, and you have so much specificity, but his mother was a nurse, and when he was 3 years old, she took him to meet a brand new baby who was born nearby named Rosalind, the girl he married.
Yes. So,
but now I remember, Carter was my first president. First time I walked into the Oval, he was standing there. His wife, Rosalind, was considered the steel magnolia, right? But Carter could be a street fighter.
Yeah, but just on that story, I mean, it's kind of amazing. So Miss Lillian, Jimmy's mother, delivered Rosalind Smith was her name. And so they met, Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter met 93 years ago.
Wow.
And they have not been together all that time because Rosalind became a friend of Jimmy's sister, and they didn't really see each other until Jimmy was in the Navy, and then they fell in love at that point. But Jimmy Carter is not only the longest living president, he has the longest marriage of any American president. It's now 74 years of marriage that they've had. I'm sorry, we were going to talk about what next. You asked me a question and I started to answer about Rosalind.
But I said that President Carter could be a real street fighter when he had to be.
Oh yeah. So the smile is deceptive. He really has three smiles. He's got this big public smile that became very famous, warm, sometimes genuine, often just for campaigning and his public appearances. Then he has a tight-lipped, smile where his eyes are flashing. That's when he's mad. And he gets angry a lot, but he's not a yeller. He just bores in on you with these steely blues. And he's a very, very tough, often difficult, all business person, not the Jimmy Carter that you see on TV behind the scenes. Then there's a relaxed, genuine smile, a third smile for when he gets off a dry, often very biting, sometimes very funny line, which again, people don't expect out of him. It's often at somebody else's expense. Now on race, just to your question about his being bare knuckle. He develops a social conscience and becomes an integrationist when he's in the Navy. He defends a Black midshipman who's been hazed. He stands up for his crewmates who are Black when they're not invited to a party that everybody was supposed to go to. But when his father dies, he returns home, and for 18 years, he ducks the civil rights movement. When he's on the school board, he does nothing to enforce Brown versus Board of Education. Of course, if he had, the schools would have closed because a Georgia state law said if you integrate, all the schools close. Nonetheless, he was not covering himself in glory. And when he ran for governor the second time and was elected, it was he didn't say anything explicitly racist, but it was kind of a dog whistle code word campaign. We talked about law and order, local control, all the things to tell the rednecks that he was on their side. Not proud of it, didn't like talking to me about it when I was pressing him. Then after he becomes governor, he makes up for lost time, and he does really great things as governor of Georgia on race and as president and a former president. So the lesson to me is, he was silent about segregation the way too many of us have been silent about police brutality. And the issue is not really our long silence. It's what do we do now? And that's where Carter has a great lesson. Like, yes, he ducked the civil rights movement, but he's been making up for it and atoning for it for the rest of his life.
Shakespeare and Julius Caesar wrote, "The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often turret in their bones." Many of Carter's landmark achievements, and man, did he have them, if not outright buried, were co-opted by his replacement, Ronald Reagan. Does that sound familiar? Anyway, but I do think it's worth listing some of his accomplishments that I learned from your book, and I had just forgotten. The first whistleblower protections, the first inspectors general. He diversified the judiciary. He appointed RBG to the Circuit Court of Appeals. He hired more women than any president before or since. That was amazing. But his crowning achievement might have been the Camp David Accords. And at that time, that was something.
Yeah, I mean, there were many foreign policy achievements. And before I talk about those, it just, on the Whistleblower Act, Trump would not have been impeached without these Carter era laws. And there were many of them. Like, Trump has, I think, 3 bills that he signed of any significance. Carter had dozens. The press got really bored with them. And like when he would do things like say, okay, well, public utilities, we sign a bill that allows public utilities to use clean energy. Kind of a big thing, right? And everybody yawned, oh, another bill signing, who cares? He's putting solar panels up on the roof of the White House, which is how my book starts. Reagan takes them down, who cares? Just another photo op. The press was very cynical after Watergate, right? So there were many, he signed more bills in 4 years than either Bill Clinton or Barack Obama did in 8 years, in many, many areas. And he failed on certain things, on welfare reform and tax reform, but he succeeded, particularly on the environment with the Superfund and doubling the amount of national parks protected. Just to use a current example, so there's 5 million acres in the Northwest that are on fire, right? Which seems like a lot, and it really is. That's a lot of land. Jimmy Carter protected 100 million acres in Alaska, from development. But on Camp David, this was just an amazing achievement, and it ended. The Israelis and the Egyptians had fought 4 wars, and there hasn't been a shot fired in anger since then. It would not have happened without Carter. So I make a kind of a novel argument that even though Carter seems very pro-Palestinian, and he is, that deeds are more important than words, and he did more for the security of the state of Israel than any president since his hero, Harry Truman.
Now, today, Donald Trump is considered a hero for Israel and has just signed a peace deal with a handful of Arab countries. How does that compare to the Camp David Accords in terms
Well, there are 2, the UAE, and then they threw in Bahrain.
Right.
Israel and the UAE and Bahrain had never been at war. I mean, the Egyptian army was the only army capable of actually destroying Israel, driving Israel into the sea. So there's, I applaud Trump for his role in this deal. I think it was more Netanyahu. He didn't actually negotiate the deal the way Jimmy Carter did for 13 days at Camp David. And it was, Sadat and Begin each threatened to walk out 3 times.
How did he get him to stay in that room?
It was a tour de force. To me, it's a really compelling story. First, he had to separate them. So they couldn't be in the same room. They were yelling at each other so much on the first and second days that he separated them. They saw each other when they took a field trip to Gettysburg, but that was it until the deal was signed. So he was shuttling between the cabins at Camp David. And then one thing that I didn't realize, so they come back, they sign these accords, but all they are is an agreement to make an agreement. And there were certain requirements that had to be met. And Begin started to back away almost immediately. So in March of 1979, 6 months later, Carter has to travel to the Middle East. His advisors say, do not do this. You will just be shining a light on the failure of Camp David. The whole thing had fallen apart, and he put it back together with chewing gum and baling wire in the Middle East. And so he really brought peace twice. And that is only the beginning of what he accomplished. So like, I didn't know that with China, for instance. So Nixon opened the door. Carter is the one who recognized China and started what became the most important bilateral relationship in the world. China at that time was less than a third world country, right? And it was only in partnership with Deng Xiaoping that what we think of as the global economy was established. Panama Canal treaties, super heavy lift, prevented war in Central America.
Speaking of preventing war, I didn't recall that that revolution and war was being fomented in Central America. How did the Panama Canal Treaty stop that?
So, what had happened was that when we dug the canal, 120 plus years ago, it was with the understanding that there would eventually be another deal. And so earlier presidents started to negotiate it, but it was a complete loser because Ronald Reagan made his political career saying, we built it, we own it, we're not giving it back, right? So Ford, Nixon, Johnson, they all knew, even though there was unrest in Panama because it was on their territory, that it wasn't technically American territory in the canal zone. If you looked at the treaty, so Carter had to get deeply into it. He got the treaty completed, and then amazingly, especially for a guy who had a lot of problems with Capitol Hill, and it took a 2/3 vote to win approval of the treaties, and 2/3 of the country was against that. So think about how, like right now, 2/3 of the country is for all kinds of things that can't pass the Congress. Imagine when 2/3 of the country is against it, and it still eventually gets passed. Amazing story about how he gets it through. And one of the main reasons is the Pentagon said, this will be another Vietnam. We will have to send 100,000 troops there at a minimum. And once somebody attacks the canal, then they'll basically have to stay there forever. We'll have to have a military force there guarding the canal and fighting off Panamanian terrorists forever. So this was a huge deal, and it also transformed our relationship in the entire Western Hemisphere with all the other countries too, because the whole gringo go home thing stopped.
And ultimately led to human rights in Central America, which hadn't ever been considered.
But it did help a lot on the human rights policy, but a lot of that was carried by this wonderful woman who'd come out of the civil rights movement named Pat Darien, who was the first Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. Carter created that position. And the human rights policy was hypocritical in certain ways. We supported the Shah of Iran, we supported Marcos in the Philippines, and other examples. But in many areas, in both the communist and authoritarian worlds, Carter's human rights policy eventually brought enormous change. And even a lot of Republicans who had been making fun of it later admitted that it was very important in ending the Cold War. And it set a global standard for the first time of how governments should treat their own people. So he loves, as much as the Constitution and the Declaration, he loves the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was in 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt championed it, but it had never been implemented until Carter's human rights policy. He kind of like globalized the civil rights movement. And it's amazing, like reading what people like Václav Havel say about Jimmy Carter and his role in some people think that generations from now, Carter will be one, this very distinguished Harvard professor believes Carter will be one of the only American presidents who's remembered like a couple hundred years from now because of what that did in the rest of the world.
What did he do wrong that allowed the Reagan Revolution to go forward?
So he did a lot wrong, and my book is warts and all, but basically he was politically ham-handed, and he thought that politics was for campaigning, and that when you governed, you could kind of stop thinking about politics until you got into election season. But the two main things, well, there were three real reasons why Carter lost in 1980. The first was the economy. It was horrible. We had double-digit inflation and double-digit interest rates. Mm-hmm. What happened was Carter named Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. And Volcker, people think Reagan named Volcker. Volcker jacked up interest rates in order to end inflation, which was really hurting the country, this ruinous inflation. But the inflation didn't get tamed until Reagan was president. So at the time, like in the fall of 1980, 40 years ago, Volcker, who Carter knew was going to be independent, jacks up interest rates in September of 1980. It's pretty hard to win a presidential election that way. So, but it turned out to be great for the country eventually. Then the other thing is Ted Kennedy challenged him because he wasn't liberal enough, which, you know, I had worked part-time for Ted Kennedy in 1980. It was one of the dumbest things I ever did because a big chunk of the Democratic Party didn't like that Jimmy Carter was for things like a balanced budget, and he wasn't sexy. I mean, I put Andy Warhol on the cover to tell people that he actually was cool in '76, but by 1980 he was uncool. A lot of people went for Kennedy. They had a very messy convention. It hurt Carter a lot. And then the third thing, of course, was the hostages. And, you know, that was a policy that eventually worked. The hostages all came home alive, but Carter looked weak in the process. It looked like he was being held hostage by the Iranians. And he made a terrible mistake against his better judgment in letting the Shah into the United States. And when he did that, that's what precipitated the seizure of the hostages. He knew it was a bad idea when he was being pressured by Kissinger and Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, even Brzezinski. He, at one point, and this really surprised me, he said, "Fuck the Shah." You know, you wouldn't think Jimmy Carter would say that. Fuck the Shah. But then on a humanitarian impulse, when it looked like the Shah was going to die in Mexico, he let him in. But it turned out that was a ruse. Right. That the Rockefeller people hoodwinked Carter into thinking that the Shah could not be treated in Mexico and he would die there. So Carter...
In fact, they had very good medicine there.
They had plenty of good medicine there. But that whole story of how that unfolded is, you know, I think that even people who followed it closely at the time will learn a lot of new things from the book.
Well, I certainly did in reading it and enjoyed it. And I'm going to pivot now to the current campaign. We have 20 minutes left to go. And for all of you who are tuning in, if you go to the chat box at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, you can ask a question. Just type a question in and I'll ask that of Jonathan. But let's start with this. You pointed it out already. Oh, by the way, I just need to brag about you for a minute, John. At Joe Biden's acceptance speech last month, the one that was taped, those looking closely could see under a pile of papers on Biden's desk, your book on Roosevelt. Ha.
That was pretty cool.
That was pretty cool. Anyway, Jimmy Carter's election campaign, like the current one, was waged against a backdrop of diplomatic and economic disasters, America held hostage, out of control inflation, which was a carryover from the Ford administration. Remember whip inflation now?
Right.
When interest rates were edging 20%, there was a gas crisis when gas was a wallet-crushing 74 cents a gallon. But I digress. Anyway, those were all laid at his feet. Now we have a killer pandemic, wildfires and hurricanes, economic collapse, racial tensions. Will those be laid at President Trump's feet, and why not?
Well, I think a lot of them will. I mean, I'm not going to make a prediction about the election because I think it's still, you know, quite possible for Trump to win. But he's riding into headwinds. And I think if Biden asks at the end of one of the debates, the way Reagan did in 1980, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is America better off? Are we a more unified country? Are we a more peaceful country? Most people would say, no, of course not. So I think Democrats tend to get a little traumatized about Trump. And, he's not in a good place politically. He can recover. There's still time. But COVID is a problem. He can't just kind of wish away 200,000 American deaths. Now, his people, that 40+%, but I think 40% is the floor.
That seems dug in, according to...
They're dug in, and that's the Fifth Avenue crowd. And, he could shoot somebody and they'd still vote for him. And it's funny that's now, when we think of the way Fifth Avenue used to be thought of, that we now think of them as the Fifth Avenue crowd, the Trumpsters out in the rest of the country who would excuse him if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue. But they are very energized. Our daughter, Charlotte Alter, who writes for Time Magazine, just did a series of pieces from Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan that were a little bit scary. There was a lot of Trump energy there. And
speaking of energy,
pro-Trump.
Speaking of energy, the effort to fill the seat left vacant by Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death has upended this campaign and energized both sides, right? How?
Well, I think Democrats are just understandably furious at the idea of a second Supreme Court seat being stolen. We're looking at, this would be the fifth majority, 5 is a majority, the fifth Supreme Court seat that was appointed by a president who didn't get the most popular votes. So, the anti-democratic part of this, the memories of what was the just rank hypocrisy of it, it really is mobilizing Democrats. And just since last Friday, they've raised $150 million. I mean, any worries about the Democrats being financially competitive are over. The real question is whether they will engage with these call tools, which is the way political engagement now works. That everybody here, they can, where it used to be they'd have to go to Pennsylvania, they can right now be using call tools to call voters in Pennsylvania and or in other states. And so the question is whether Democrats will stop wringing their hands and start ringing the phones, and really get out there. And a lot of it is a GOTV, get out the vote issue, because there is not a lot of enthusiasm for Joe Biden. A lot of people are going to vote for him. He's going to get the most votes. But Trump could still run Trump spent less than Hillary the last time. He could still run a kind of a thread the needle and still win this election.
And also, this is no longer the olden days. We know, because our government has told us, that Russia is starting to interfere in the election. There is cheating. There will be some voter suppression. And
I think there's a lot of voter suppression. A lot of voter suppression, because it's been, the fish rots from the head. And so you have a lot of local Republicans who now think it's just part of what their party does to suppress the vote, use any lever. They're in court all over the place. In Pennsylvania, they're trying to prevent more drop boxes for votes, for voting. Obviously, we know they're messing with the post office. So on several different fronts, I'm actually in some ways more worried about that than the Russians. I'm more worried about just what, ordinary Republicans are doing. And so it's very worrisome. It's a real concern. I don't think that Trump saying, "Oh, I won on election night," is going to win the election for him. The country can wait until the votes are counted, but I'm really worried about these 50,000 Trump poll workers. If you know anybody in a battleground state, especially if they're younger and not at as much COVID risk, urge them to become poll workers. I mean, this is not like and I think a lot of people in my business, we're off the sidelines. Like when democracy is at stake it's all hands on deck, and so it's like, I remember reading about the Munich Post. Hitler won an election. I'm not, by the way, comparing Trump to Hitler, though there's some interesting comparisons. But, that was an election. And the Munich Post said, oh, well, we need to be fair to both sides in this election, all sides, because it was a multi-party system. Wasn't that long after the election, the Munich Post was closed and its editors died in concentration camps. So, at a certain point when democracy is on the line, this kind of false equivalence or phony objectivity, it has to go away. And I think actually, even though there was a very good article by Jim Fallows in The Atlantic warning that the press is falling into some of the traps of 2016, CNN, the New York Times, they have stepped up. They call a lie, and there's been some real progress in the last 4 years.
But the way people get their information is now so stratified.
Exactly. That's really, really a problem. John, Facebook is kind of an evil force at this point.
And still, even though they say they have set limits?
There's an article in the paper today about how they're completely toothless and they can't even get QAnon off. QAnon people are hiding in yoga groups, literally. It's Facebook is a frickin' disaster. It's a toxic waste dump.
We have some very impressive neighbors here tuning in, and I'm changing the subject a little. I want to go to former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson. Hi, Jay, who asks, Jonathan, what does Jimmy Carter think of Bill Clinton?
Great question, Jay. So not a lot. And I he was being a little diplomatic, but when I asked him point blank, he said basically, Bill Clinton is interested in Bill Clinton. And then that was his answer. And it's mutual. And they have a very fraught relationship, even though Clinton gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom when he was president. It began when Carter was president and Fidel Castro released thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of prisoners from Cuba. He emptied out the jails in the Mariel boat lift.
Right.
Some of them were great dissidents and some of them were criminals. And a number of them went to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and they rioted there. And Clinton thought he lost for re-election in 1980 because of Carter. Then when Clinton becomes president, he is kind of pushed by Al Gore and other people to use Carter because Carter's connections are indispensable. So particularly in 1994, Clinton is trying to force Raul Cedras, the dictator of Haiti, out of power. And he has the fleet offshore in Haiti, and they're about to come ashore. There's about to be a war in Haiti. People completely forget this. And Jimmy Carter, Salmon, and Colin Powell go down there. They prevent a war, especially Carter. But then when Carter comes back, instead of going to report directly to the president, he goes on CNN first. Then he goes to North Korea, and he does actually North Korea was earlier. He does the same thing in 1994 in North Korea, where he prevents a war, and he goes on CNN first. And he exceeds his instructions, because I think Clinton actually did want to bomb the reactor in North Korea, which conservatives said, well, that would have ended North Korea's nuclear program. No, it wouldn't have. They would have just rebuilt it, probably in a hurry after Clinton bombed it. So it was better the way Carter did it. But understandably, his successors, especially Clinton, thought that his ego had gotten the better of him. And that did mar his presidency. George H.W. Bush, I interviewed. Clinton would only talk to me about Carter off the record, which might tell you something. George H.W. Bush gave me a good interview, and Barack Obama did as well, although Obama's was too late for the first printing of the book. But Bush, not long before he died, gave me an interview. And he had been very close to Carter in the early days of his administration, not mostly through Jim Baker, but they had worked together on a number of things. Then in the run-up to the Gulf War, Carter wrote letters to all the heads of state saying, vote against this in the UN, which understandably infuriated President Bush because there's only one president at a time, and he was being like a freelance Secretary of State, some of Bush's people wanted to bring him up on the Logan Act, and they didn't do that. And at the end of our interview, George H.W. Bush was very complimentary of Jimmy Carter in general, genuinely complimentary of him as a human being, and thinks he did a lot of things as president that weren't recognized. But he was still ticked off about what happened in 1991 with the Gulf War.
Let's pivot now to the debate. So a week from tonight, the first debate. You and I have had front porch conversations about this. What, given everything that's changed just in the past week, what do you expect Biden to ask or say as he opens it?
That's a great question. I think if he was really being aggressive, he would say, look, a lot of things are going to be said tonight. I'm not going to have time to correct all of the president's factual inaccuracies, but you should know that neutral sources have identified more than 20,000 lies that the president has told. So I think we can expect that we will hear some tonight. I would ask you to judge my credibility based on my years in public life against his. And of course, Trump will then say, well, you plagiarized and you lied about where you graduated at Syracuse Law School. And Biden should then say, they need to get into it. If Biden tries to stay above the fray, he's going to lose the debate. Biden should then say, oh, okay, you can say that, Mr. President, but your own sister is on tape saying you had somebody else take the SATs for you. So, anytime he goes after him, he has to come back. And on COVID, and this I think is really important, Biden needs a metaphor for the incompetence, just mind-blowing incompetence of the last 8 months. And Michael Lewis, the great author, was on this podcast that our son Tommy Alter co-hosts with the basketball star JJ Redick, and he's just on this podcast, the most recent one, and he gave a perfect metaphor for Biden to use, and it's fire the coach. It's like Americans are great. We have all these great scientists, these really inventive, energetic people. We had, in some ways, we were the most set up to respond to an epidemic of any country in the world before this. But it's like a team with all the best players, and they have a losing season. Why? Because no leadership. So it's time to fire the coach, and because he failed. And he said, this to me is the number one thing that Biden needs to say. You said, and you should get the date, I take no responsibility at all. It's the job of the president to take responsibility, not say it's up to the states. Like, how about if it was like we were in World War II? Oh, let Montana make sure that the Germans don't come in over the Canadian border. Let Texas make sure that the Japanese don't come up from Mexico. We're one country, and Biden does a good job of saying it's the United States of America. So I think he will stress that point, but he has to hammer away at it, and he has to stay on his feet because Trump is formidable in these situations. He carries a sense of authority. He's so confident, and Biden can sometimes get a little tongue-tied. As we know, he was a stutterer. So he has to keep his composure but stay aggressive.
How do you see broadcast networks handling election night? We're so accustomed to being able to call an election state by state so that it's pretty much polished off by 11 at night. That's probably not going to happen this time. So
I think they're not going to do this, but I think what they should do is do nothing like what percent reporting. Like they should just, because that's a meaningless figure when you have all these people who are voting by mail. Right. It's like, that those returns on election night are not necessarily worth anything. Now, if based on, significant returns, it's impossible for one or the other to catch up. If you want to call, Idaho for Trump and New York for Biden, fine. But through most of the rest of the state, there's no harm in waiting and not reporting a lot of partial returns. It's going to be very hard for the press to do that. But, everybody's talking about how there's going to be election month, and that's true, and it may be a couple of days before we find out who's president. We also might find out on election night, because if Trump underperforms on election day when most of his people are voting, they will be able to use projections from the early voting to call some states that you might not assume otherwise. And also, in just like a week or two, we're going to be seeing exit polls based on early voting. So we're going to get a sense. We know that more Democrats vote by mail, but we're going to get a sense based on those early voting models, which are very sophisticated, about what turnout levels are like.
What I should say, Carol Schlein is weighing in here, saying for anyone who wants to be a poll watcher for early voting election day or after, in Pennsylvania, they can sign up and get training in early October at padems.com. And I'm sure that there are those around the country, and for Republicans who are interested in being involved, I'm sure that there are places as well. Shirley Grill, John asks, can you get the message about what Biden should do at the debate to the Biden campaign?
Hi, Shirley. You know, I've been tweeting this kind of stuff, and I do know some of the Biden people. I think they're pretty smart about this kind of thing. They have a lot of debate prep experience, and I think they're going to do fine without me advising them.
Is Trump an anomaly or a harbinger of things to come? Is this a beginning of a move that you don't see the United States turning around on anytime soon?
Not necessarily. I actually think next year can be as great a year as 2020 has sucked, because if there's a big Democratic victory, then we can really move in another direction. And the United States has a great ability to renew itself. Trump is not doing well with young voters, not at all. And they're not buying what he's selling.
Like 17 million new voters since the last election.
They're not buying his cheesy nightclub act. And
what goes to the Supreme Court, John?
What if
the election is close enough that it has to be decided?
I don't think that that's very likely to happen, actually. And I think that would, I covered the Florida recount. That was kind of a perfect storm. I was in Florida when the Supreme Court rendered its decision. I don't think that's that likely. I think the bigger thing that involves the court is what happens after the Republicans ram through this nomination. And the Democrats are going to have a big decision to make next year about whether they want to expand the court. And, I have, and I think the Republicans will have a big decision too if they manage to delay this nomination until the lame duck session, which is quite possible. So Mitt Romney and even Mitch McConnell, they haven't said when the vote will be. And it's pretty easy to delay things for a little while. Remember, the thing Biden said is that the shortest in the modern era is like 48 days or something. So this would be the shortest from the time of nomination to confirmation, right? So there's a number of steps so they would have to be ramming this through in the next 3 weeks. They might want to do that, but the polls show that over 60%, I think 67%, think that's a bad idea. So if you're the Republican Party, you might not want to do that. You might want to be confident that you can win the election. But if they don't win, at that point, during the lame duck session, the Republicans will be very tempted to ram it through. They need to be put on notice. If they do that, they will take what is already a 5-4 majority and they will expand it to 6-3. But remember, right now they have 5-4, right? So to get to 6-3, conservatives to liberals, they risk losing 7-6. Because if the Democrats take the Senate, they are shit serious about expanding the Supreme Court.
Right.
And I think even Joe Manchin would go along. There will be so much emphasis on that among the Democratic base early next year. So there's a very decent chance that we would add 3 members to the court. Now, it's not in the Constitution, the number of members of the Supreme Court, by majority vote, 51 votes, or 50 if they have the Democratic vice president.
That was the next question. Now, John, if we were in the same room, I'd kick you in the shins by way of saying we've got to wrap this up. You have 1 minute before you have to go accept your National Emmy Award.
He's
not going to.
I'm not going to win. I don't think.
What can we learn from your book? Why should this book resonate now?
Well, we're in a dark time, and he's an inspiration that we can have a smart, honest president. Jimmy Carter exaggerated, but he did not lie. A president who looks to the future. And there is a tragic dimension to this that is very relevant. So when we look at the wildfires and the hurricanes, we think about climate change. As he was leaving office, Jimmy Carter was laying plans to address what was then called carbon pollution in the scientific community. He read all the scientific journals. I found him underlying in the journal Science in 1971 articles about climate change.
But
He was going to address climate change in the early 1980s. And he started to address it with the first fuel economy standards, right?
We
were going to have hybrids
driving
by the middle of the
electric cars
1980s.
in 1984, right?
So what this is it tells you, and everybody in this audience knows how important elections and politics are. So it tells you that literally the fate of the planet was involved on the ballot in 1980, and it is again today, and in so many different ways. And so I just think it's important in terms of mobilizing people to just, anybody who says, it doesn't really matter all that much, they need to get a polite argument from you, and I'm sure they will because you're from Montclair.
All right, thank you, Jonathan, so much. Congratulations for this wonderful book. It really is an amazing read, especially for us history geeks.
I'm looking forward to signing everybody's book and inscribing everybody's book who wants to buy one in Montclair.
Okay, thank you all for joining us and listening, and back to you, Carrie.